Welcome back. Welcome back. Well, this is my first official podcast. What is this podcast called again? Oh, yeah. NB Mob. It's been so long. It's been like 5 weeks. I'm already forgetting stuff. But this is the first podcast since I went on a month-long road trip. It was originally supposed to be 2 weeks. And you might be asking, why the hell did you go on a month-long road trip, Patrick? And it's a good question. I didn't really have a single answer for that. I was thinking about a bunch of different things, and I guess this first little mini episode is just going to be about why I decided to go on this road trip. So first and foremost, I just really like road trips. I've been on two of them before. The first one was around the national parks out west, kind of in the Nevada, Arizona, Utah region. That was after I had graduated college with a couple of friends. We went around in a van called the Juicy Lucy, and that was a blast. And then a couple years later, I went with a friend to Alaska, and we did these various day trips where we were centered in Anchorage, and we would go out to, Wrangell St. Elias National Park or Denali or wherever, and Kenai Fjords. So that was cool. And it's been a couple years. This one was a solo trip, and I really put no planning into it aside from when I was going to leave and renting the car 2 weeks in advance. Um, but the various reasons that I went on this trip were actually first and foremost was I see this country as being in a time of immense transition. So just like previously there was the transition from many, many thousands of years ago, there was a transition from hunter gatherers to agriculture, and then there was a transition from agriculture to industry with the industrial revolution like 200 years ago. Now we're switching to a new form of economy, of society, a technological one, and we're switching from industry to technology. So we're going through an immense societal transition, and I really wanted to see the different parts of the country as we go through that transition, and particularly just prior to the 2020 election, which, as I've talked about before, and as I think we're all realizing, is going to be a total shit show. So there was that, and I also really wanted to leave the coastal bubble, so to speak, and project what I saw back to people who are in the bubble. And if you live in a coastal city and have pretty much grown up in a coastal city, and sure, you've traveled, but you travel to the other coast, to those cities, and you pretty much spend most of your time in the wealthier suburbs around the big cities. And when I say the big cities, I mean like, Boston, New York, Washington, D.C., Chicago, L.A., and San Francisco. Then you might not realize it, but you are in a bubble, in an affluent bubble. And I have been thinking about this for a while, particularly since reading. There's two primary forms of poverty in this country, and there's urban poverty and there's rural poverty. And there's definitely different demographics to those. Obviously, inner city poverty tends to be more black, and rural poverty tends to be more white, with other demographics mixed in, of course. But I think it's something that people don't really get a true sense of, and it can explain much of the cultural divide in this country. And it's something that I realized actually on the trip as I was sending photos of what I saw back to my friends and family in the various places around the country, that the framing of what you choose to focus on really determines the sense of how large uh, an issue something is, or the perceptions that the audience has, because you are the lens in which they are viewing something that they actually haven't seen. So it really started to make me think of the distorting effect of media in the way that it presents reality. And reality is immensely complex, and we try to put our simplified narratives over that, and that causes us to view things in a certain way. And it's sort of cyclical in how it operates, because we build the narratives from what we see, but the narratives also dictate what we see. So, um, for example, homelessness was a major issue, a major character throughout this whole trip. And I was trying to take pictures of homelessness. I was trying to take pictures of really just the good, the bad, and the ugly of the United States and send it back, because I always want to show the fullness of something. And that's an ideal, because you can never show the full total complexity of something because it's infinite. But I think that really needs to be in the 21st century, how we start to view the world as something complex and that we don't fully understand. And I think that's how we should view our society. I think it's how we should view our country. I think it's how we should view ideas. And I think it's really how we should view ourselves and each other as something ultimately not fully knowable, but certainly not as overly simplistic as we try to make everything. We try to caricature everything, and it's really how our brains work. But if I, for example, with the homelessness issue, if I just go around the country taking pictures of every instance of homelessness I see, every person, every encampment, everything that bothers me, then you're going to get the impression that all this country is homelessness. You're going to get a disproportionate sense of what the country is. It's just purely homelessness and people struggling to get by. And while this is a trend that we need to focus on and try to fix, particularly in this COVID era that we're in, it would be wrong to assume that it is everything. And I think that is happening with whatever people are choosing to focus on right now. It's happening with racism and prejudice too, where, a group that goes out, or an individual that goes out and just tries to snapshot images or instances of prejudice and racism, is going to start to see society as purely a prejudiced, racist thing, rather than just, hey, this is a problem, but it's still not all defining. Same thing with political correctness on the other kind of political side. Is if you want to take the most egregious examples of people um, kind of imposing their views and restricting yours and being authoritarian, then you can go out and find the worst examples of that for sure, and get a sense of and really build an impression that it's everything at once, rather than, okay, there are some points in this and some people go too far, right? So yeah, we need to be more careful with how we frame the reality, the totality of all of the information in front of us. And we need to kind of be less chaotic about it. So I was keeping that in mind. And I was also thinking through a lot of family things, the transition of my family, and some issues that are ongoing, and also really the future of my family, the future of myself, the future of this country, the future of humanity. All of those things layered and nested together. Um, I will also say that I didn't really have a plan as to where I was going to visit over this trip. I had a couple ideas, like I wanted to visit uh, Badlands National Park and Glacier National Park, and otherwise, I think Mount Rushmore. And aside from that, I had no idea I was going to spend the time. I said I'm going to set 2 weeks aside. I ended up extending that by another 2 weeks, gradually, bit by bit. I must have really been annoying the rental company. Um, by the way, the amount of grasshoppers that were plastered over the front hood of the car and the grill was really repulsive. It was insane. It made me think that if Americans can consider eating bug protein, grasshoppers, crickets, whatever, then we have a pretty infinite source of food out there in the plains. But that is not going to happen anytime soon. The Chinese certainly have a leg up on the Americans in their willingness to eat insects if necessary. um, so yeah, it's a lot of the aspects of this trip is very layered. It's almost like the carbon copies of when you're filling out an invoice, how there you have 5 sheets. There's about 5 different layers to this trip, and I'll make little mini episodes about a couple of them. But um, I when I was going into this, wasn't even planning to visit friends or family. I was just going to do this purely solo. And one of the most rewarding parts of this trip was just visiting a lot of my family members who I'd never seen in their natural element where they live before. I had only seen them when they'd come east and visited. So that was really rewarding. Everybody was super hospitable, and also seeing some old friends, some friends from college, and then some new friends from the Iowa caucus earlier in the year, some friends from Yang Gang. So that was really cool as well. Um, I also went to a lot of memorials, and that's not really typically a part of a trip, but it was one of the most eye-opening aspects of the trip. I saw a lot of tragedy was integrated into the trip, and reflection on that tragedy, and sort of who I can be and who we can be moving forward was part of that. Um, and then obviously national parks. I'm big on national parks. It's one of the few things that you can really point at and say, hey, this is a government institution that is pretty much doing something right most of the time. It's very hard to look at national parks and say these are a waste of money or a shit show. Um, the last aspect was really the last layer of the trip was there's really 2 more. One of them was race and civil rights. I went to a lot of places related to the civil rights movement and the 1960s, 1970s, and then the last bit was various pieces of pop culture and Americana and just weirdness. So I'll try to talk about those various things. I returned from this trip with more reflection, more knowledge, certainly more bumper stickers and t-shirts, and some more books and ideas for future podcasts. But I'm really looking forward to sharing them with you. So stay tuned, and I will have, beyond these couple monologue episodes, I'm going to have some dialogues with people soon, which are going to be pretty interesting, I think. And stay tuned for those.